Thank you guys again for being here. We are continuing a 5-part series called Other People's Mail that we started last week. And what we're doing, if you weren't here last week or if you just don't remember, I'll catch us up. But the situation, what we're doing with this series is there's a book at the end of the Bible that everybody is probably somewhat aware of because it's very weird. And the book is called Revelation. And so the book of Revelation is 22 chapters long. The first chapter is like this introductory chapter, and we're not going to talk about that necessarily directly in this series, but chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation are a series of like mini letters to these 7 different churches in ancient what would have been referred to as Asia Minor at the time. Now it's modern day Turkey. And so you have these 7 mini letters to 7 different communities, all going through different kinds of things. And so before the writer launches into all of this very bizarre, very strange imagery that we could spend lots and lots of other like deeper amounts of time on, we don't have that kind of time. But what we are going to do is we're going to look at 5 of those 7 letters and basically ask questions about like, okay, what did this person feel like he needed to say specifically to this community? How is it different than the things he says to the other communities? And then how do we, 2,000 years later, how do we receive this and ask questions about like, okay, what things that are being said here continue to ring true today? Because often we often will take not just Revelation, but all of the Bible, we will read it as if it was written out of a vacuum and look at it today and ask all kinds of questions that don't ever consider question like the initial question, which is like, wait, who are we reading somebody else's mail? Are we looking through the eyes of somebody else? Are we trying to receive something that was not originally written to us? But even though it wasn't originally written to us, does it actually have something to say? Like, is there a deeper truth to be searched for within these words, even though it was written to a group of people in a specific place at a specific time? So that's what we're doing with this series. So last week, we looked at the first mini letter, which was a letter from this guy named John who wrote all of Revelation. John is in exile. And there's a whole like backstory, and there's lots of speculation as to why John is in exile. He is on an island called Patmos, or a Greek island called Patmos, and he's writing to these churches basically as a way of saying like, I can't be where you are, but I have things that I want you to know, and I have comfort I need to offer you. And so last week we looked at the letter he wrote to the people in the city of Ephesus, and so today we're going to look at the second of the 7 mini letters that he writes, which is to a group of people in a city called Smyrna. And or Smyrna, depending on where you grew up in the world. But Smyrna tends to be how the smart people that I know say this. So that's how I'm going to say it. So we're going to look at what John has to say to the people of Smyrna. And so in Revelation chapter 2, verse 8, it says, and this is right after the letter that we looked at last week. So it says, to the angel. And last week, we talked about how the word angel here is not, when John uses this word, he's not necessarily talking about somebody like with wings and a harp and a halo. He's saying angel is the Greek word angelos. And so it literally means messenger. So John is saying to whomever's job it is to speak to the community in this particular place and at this particular time, I want you to convey something. So basically, John is sending this letter, and he understands everyone won't have direct access to reading this letter. It's going to go to the angelos. It's going to go to the messenger. The messenger's going to read it, and then he's going to convey what it says to everybody else. That's how this kind of thing worked. So he says to the angelos, to the messenger of the church in Smyrna, right? These are the words of him who is the first and the last. In other words, I'm speaking on behalf of Jesus, who died and came to life again. Bless you. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. We will come back to that phrase. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Okay, lots of weird language in this letter. We are going to do our best to get to the bottom of some of it. We do not have time for all of it. So first of all, lots of imagery, lots of ideas, but we're going to focus on one major question, which is, what is the main idea? What is the one thing that John is trying to say to this group of people? Like, if you peel back all of the big language, what is he getting at? What does John want the people in Smyrna to understand to understand above all else? So I would argue that the thesis statement of this whole letter is found in verse 9. So let's isolate verse 9 and just look at what he says here. So in verse 9, he says, I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. So first of all, we need to real quickly get this out of the way because this phrase, synagogue of Satan, sticks out like a sore thumb and it's very distracting. So we're going to go ahead and just deal with this phrase first. So a bit of a disclaimer on this phrase. This phrase, synagogue of Satan, has over time, especially in the last like 100 or 200 years in the Western Hemisphere, been often co-opted in a very harmful, very dangerous, and very destructive way. In other words, it has been used as a way to give people, specific groups and individuals, permission towards attitudes of anti-Semitism. So, which, by the way, is not what John is doing here. So people have, historically, not even that long ago, taken this phrase and used it to justify violence and hatred toward Jewish people and communities. Absolutely, in no way is that what John is doing here. In fact, it's very noteworthy that John is Jewish. And most of John's readers are Jewish. By the way, Jesus was Jewish. So any sort of anti-Semitism that is drawn out of that is bad theology. And so we need to get that out of the way right out of the gate. So then we are left with the question, okay, so if John isn't saying that, which obviously he is not, what is John saying? What is he doing with this phrase? So, and I will fully acknowledge here, there is no scholarly consensus on what John is talking about here. There are theories, there's speculation. There is no larger group that widely agrees on exactly what John is doing. There just isn't enough historical information to make a firm conclusion. There are a couple of pretty good theories, and so I will give you what the theories are. So the first theory is, when John says the synagogue of Satan, because one of the things he says here, he says, who say they are Jews and are not. So his accusation isn't these people are Jewish and we need to be angry at them about that. He's saying they are pretending, they are not Jewish even though they are pretending that they are. So one theory on this is that maybe there were Gentiles, non-Jewish people in the city of Smyrna who were pretending to be Jewish in order to draw negative attention, basically to draw negative attention towards the Jewish community. So John, in fact, John even uses the word slander here, as if to say, like, yeah, we understand that there are people who are co-opting your imagery, our language, our traditions, and they're doing it in such a negative way that it's intentionally drawing negative attention towards our community. And so that is one theory. I think that's a pretty sound theory. Another theory that also could very easily be right is maybe there were religious fundamentalists in the community who called themselves Jewish, but a lot of them were doing harmful things and bringing, again, lots of, one of the things we know is whatever this group was doing, they were absolutely drawing negative attention towards the larger group of people. So either this was people who were like falsely taking on this banner as a way of making people look bad, or they were people who saw themselves as like, we are the true like Jewish followers, but they were so like dogmatic and fundamentalist and hurtful towards other people that it was creating a lot of backlash towards everybody else. Either way, what we know is there's a group of people in the community that John is referring to, and he's saying, like, whatever it is that they're doing, it's blowing back on you, and it's causing negative attention to be drawn. So, and also, by the way, the word Satan here, we, not unlike a lot of the words we tend to sort of, because of how we grew up, we tend to sort of take and we assume it means certain things, because he says the synagogue of Satan. Satan here, we often imagine a character like horns, red pajamas, a pitchfork, like basically red Count Chocula is kind of how it looks in my mind. And so, but this is not what John is describing. John is not describing like what we tend to sort of assume he's describing. The word Satan here, ha-satan, literally means accuser. And so what does John say this group of people is doing? He's saying this group of people is drawing negative attention and creating slander against you. People are accusing you of doing things that you are not doing, of being guilty of things that you are not guilty of. So when he says synagogue of Satan, he's saying a group of people who basically have taken it upon themselves to draw negative and false accusations against you. And so I hope that makes sense. So essentially, John is talking about there's a group of people in Smyrna, in this community, and they are spreading in one way or another. They are spreading lots of negative ideas and accusations about this group of people that John is writing to. And this group of people that John is writing to, they're saying, we are just trying to follow the way of Jesus as best we can. We are just trying to be true to the story that we believe we're a part of. But there is this outside group of people who are very intentionally causing things to get harder for us. And they're turning people against us. And so John is acknowledging something that the people of Smyrna would have already known way too well, which is there's a group of people in your town. And they seem to exist primarily for the purpose of making other people in the community think less of you and making your life more difficult. He's acknowledging there is a certain amount of pain that comes from there are people talking about you, and it's not good. John understands that there is a certain kind of pain that comes from feeling like there are people against you. And it's often, it always feels like it's more people than you thought there were, or than is in reality sometimes. So like everybody's turning against us. People are saying things about us that aren't true. We cannot solve the crisis of like trying to save our reputation because the accusations are coming in too fast and the negativity is too strong. So John understands like there is a certain amount of pain that comes from that. So their reputation is being harmed. But it's not just that, it's going a little bit further. So look in verse 10. It says, do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil, and there's all sorts of speculation about maybe there might be a specific person in the community that he's referring to here. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. So it's not just people are spreading negative rumors and people are having like strong feelings about this group of people. It's coming down to like there are real world consequences to this. Right? Some people are actually going to jail as a result of these accusations that are being thrown out. So let's go back to verse 9 again. So in verse 9, just in the first part, he says, I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. What? Like that is a strange sentence to say to anybody. So what's going on with this phrase? So Smyrna, first of all, is a very wealthy city. It's one of the wealthier cities in this part of the world at the time. In fact, it's either the second or third wealthiest city in all of Asia Minor. It was, and there are several reasons for why. For one thing, it was a seaport city, and it was a major trade hub for the Roman Empire. The largest trade hub for the Roman Empire was Ephesus, which we looked at last week. The second largest trade hub in Asia Minor was Smyrna. And so there was a major connection between the East and the West. And so if you were coming from the East and you wanted to sell things to go into the Western part of the world, basically to sell to anyone who buys and sells through the Roman Empire, you would either go to Ephesus or you would go to Smyrna. So Smyrna is a very wealthy community. So again, Ephesus was the biggest trade hub, Smyrna's the second, very close second. So most of Smyrna is getting richer and richer every single day. Money is pouring into the city from all over the known world. So why then is this group of people getting poorer and poorer? John continues to talk about like you are poor. You are getting poor. You are sliding into like deeper and deeper poverty. So if the whole city is getting rich, but this group of people is getting poor, why is that happening? So maybe it has something to do with the slander and the jail. You know what I mean? Like it's possible if people in your community are turning against you, it is possible that could have economic consequences. Am I wrong? Like you might find yourself in a situation where people don't want to trade with you because of the reputation that has been given to you by somebody else, by somebody who does not like you. And so something seems to be happening to make this group of people largely unwanted in the city. And nobody seems to be doing business with any of them. So while everybody else is getting wealthier and wealthier and wealthier, they continue to get hungrier and hungrier. There is a certain kind of pain that comes from believing that everyone in the world is against you. And this group of people seems to understand exactly what that pain feels like. I remember several years ago when I was pastoring a church in Texas, we were, I mean, this is probably true for any profession, but in a ministry context, you will go through seasons, if you do this, you will go through seasons where it feels like every phone call is bad news. And every interaction is filled with critique and accusation, and like I have to spend the next hour defending myself because of something that somebody said on their Facebook page or something like that. Like the amount of time when I was doing this like as a full-time job, the amount of time that I found myself spending trying to like hold on to the reputation that I felt like I was trying to build for myself Like it's astounding. Like one person saying one thing about like, well, that person teaches this, and then all of a sudden I have lunch with 5 people. You know what I mean? And so it becomes like this. It's almost like this avalanche of like threat that you begin to feel. Or it's not even just like your reputation. It's like you have one person who's saying things about you that you think like that is a complete misrepresentation of a thing that I said in a sermon a year ago. And it's possible that you'll have people in your church like going through like an actual life crisis that you're also kind of trying to deal with. And there's volunteer issues and there's money issues. It is never ending. It's a very, very it can be incredibly exhausting. And I remember I was having one of those seasons several years ago, and I was at lunch with somebody, and it was one of those lunches, and it was just one of those like everything seemed like this is tense. There are people who are angry about things that, in my opinion, were not really under my control, but I was having to answer for them anyway. And so I'm sitting at this lunch, and I remember feeling my phone vibrate in my pocket, and I had like this almost like gut level, like down to my bones reaction of like, oh no, like what could this possibly be? And so I start to like shake a little bit because of what the unknown fear of whatever just happened in my phone. And then the person I'm having lunch with gets up and goes to the bathroom, and I pull out my phone real quick just to see like what could this be. It was my weather app letting me know it might be stormy later. So I silenced those notifications. But it's that thing, like you are on edge. You like there gets to this point where it feels like every phone call, every text message, every email is bad. And so you become so like I don't even know exactly how to describe it. It's like all the dials get turned up to 11, and you were just constantly just on hyper like aware alert of the next bad thing is just about to hit. As far as mental health goes, it's not a great profession to get into, honestly. So. That's just my own personal. No, God bless to everybody in the room who works here, but because I don't. But so that is a thing. All that to say, that is a thing that the people in Smyrna are going through as a community. It's like every time we leave our house, it's this sort of like, who's going to say something negative? Who's going to yell at us? Who's going to look at us and like pretend like they didn't see us? You know what I mean? And so John writes to this group of people who are going through this, who are at this like heightened level of ratcheted up anxiety, and he says, "I get it. I know that you feel alone. And I know that you feel worried about your livelihoods. I know that you are worried about what other kinds of consequences could come from other people turning the community against you. People are going to jail. This is scary." And he says, I know that this movement that you're a part of now, just by being here, is costing you something. And it is putting your livelihoods in danger. But then he says something really interesting in verse 9. He says, I know you're poor, but you are rich. What an odd thing to say to people who are poor. You might argue, like at face value, this is pretty unhelpful, because they would probably read this and think like, oh no, you are mistaken, John. We are just poor. In the New Testament, writers will often kind of play around with the concepts of poor and rich. This is not the only time this happens, actually. So you have people almost kind of redefining the terms. Like, so John says, though you are poor, in other words, like, yeah, the money is not coming in. Like, all of your neighbors are getting rich, and you aren't. But they're at some other level, within some other dimension, you remain quite rich. So for us, this seems very straightforward. The categories seem very black and white. If you have more money / possessions than most other people, you are rich. If you have less money or possessions than other people, you are poor. And so that tends to be sort of how we draw, like these tend to be the defining ways that we look at these terms. However, John is writing to a group of people who have less money and less things, and he says, I know you are poor, and yet you are rich, which again, at face value, makes no sense and could be read as a little unhelpful and offensive. But again, in the New Testament, you have these writers constantly redefining these terms. Take a look at 2 Corinthians chapter 8. So in 2 Corinthians 8, most of the letters written in what we refer to as the New Testament, most of them come from a guy named Paul. And so Paul is writing to this city, to a group of Christians in a city called Corinth. And so one of the things that Paul says in 2 Corinthians 8, and by the way, he's been having the reason this is 2 Corinthians, this is an ongoing conversation. And so he's been having this dialogue with this community of people. And in chapter 8, beginning in verse 1, he says, and now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches, which is not the group of churches that the Corinthians are in. So he says, there's this other group of people in Macedonia, and I want to tell you about them. He says, in the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability. Entirely on their own, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in the service to the Lord's people. What is going on? What is he talking about? So here's the backstory on this passage. The Jesus movement at this time that Paul is writing, the Jesus movement is very new. Things are just kind of getting started. And this whole movement started around the year 30 in the city of Jerusalem. And not long after that, it begins to spread into the rest of this part of the world at this time. And it begins to take hold in other parts of the ancient world. And eventually, it reaches a region called Macedonia. In fact, if you're familiar with some of the letters in the New Testament, there are two, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, written to a city called Thessalonica. Thessalonica is the capital of Macedonia. So Macedonia is a very impoverished region in the world. So this movement, this Jesus movement begins to spread. It takes hold in Macedonia. Macedonia it's not like Asia Minor. It's not a trade hub for anything. There are people there who are just in abject poverty. Like this is one of the poorest regions in the known world at this time. So at this time, that is going on in Macedonia. Back Jerusalem, at this time, where the whole movement began, things are getting very tense between the citizens of Judea and the Roman Empire. In fact, not long after this, Rome is going to just completely drop the hammer and destroy the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. The tension continues to ratchet up until it can't bear the weight of itself anymore. So persecution in Jerusalem is getting worse and worse and worse. And people are being taxed into extreme poverty by the Romans. People, not unlike in Smyrna, people are being jailed. People are being persecuted in all sorts of ways. And people are starving to death as a result. So Paul begins to take up a collection through the different cities where this movement spreads. And the purpose of the collection was to offer support to people back in Jerusalem, again, where the whole thing started. And because the people in Jerusalem are suffering and they're struggling to survive under the thumb of the Roman Empire. And so they did this in churches all through this, like wherever this movement has taken hold. They've sent people over and said, like, we are going to collect to send things back to Jerusalem so that people can eat and people can live. They did this everywhere except in the Macedonian churches. Why? Because the Macedonians don't have anything. And so I think we can all identify with the notion of, like, do you know how bad it would feel to go to this group of people in Macedonia and say, hey, people in Jerusalem are starving. Can you help us out? And for them to say, we're actually starving worse. And so, like, I don't know what we can tell you. So they skip the Macedonians because they think, like, all we're going to do is embarrass them, and they're going to, of no fault of their own, they're not going to be able to help us out. So we just won't even ask. So because again, you don't want to go to people who are already struggling to survive and then just ask for a donation. That's a bad look. And so the Macedonians find out that they got skipped, and they're upset about it because they actually wanted to help. And so knowing all of that, look now at what Paul has to say in 2 Corinthians 8. Let's look at it again. He writes, and now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able and even beyond their ability. Entirely on their own, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people. Why? So not only does he say they were generous, he says they urgently pleaded with us to be allowed to be generous. Why did they have to urgently plead? Because they got skipped. And when Paul was taking donations, they didn't even think to ask the Macedonians, and the Macedonians are upset about it. They have such a beating heart for other people who are suffering, and they feel this urgent, like this ache to get involved. And the idea that they weren't given the opportunity to get involved upsets them. He talks about how poor they are, but he also talks about their rich generosity. So for us, poor and rich quite often is just about, do you have a lot or do you only have a little? But for John and for Paul, poor and rich has a lot less to do with what you actually possess and everything to do with whatever it is that you already have. So what word does Paul use to introduce this story to the Macedonian churches? What does he say? He uses the word grace. Grace, so for Paul, rich has something to do with grace. Grace is an awareness of the fact that I have received some kind of gift. There is something that I have received. And knowing that I have received this gift, the next logical thing that I can do is ask myself, okay, well then if I have received this gift, what can I do now to use this gift to offer some sort of goodness or hope or life to somebody else? How can I use what I have to make somebody else's life better? Grace is something that flows through us towards other people. For Paul, rich is about the question, am I aware of what I have? And do I feel empowered to do something good with what I already have been given? By contrast, poor is less about what do I not have, and it's more about disempowerment. Poor is the feeling of I have no choices. I have no power. Therefore, if I have no power, that must mean I am poor. And poor is the feeling of when it feels like the world is getting smaller and smaller, and we have nothing to contribute to the world around us. Poor is like, why should I show up anyway? They can just do it without me. Poor is I have nothing to contribute. Poor is I bring nothing to the table. Poor is when we feel boxed in by our circumstances and all I can do is simply try to survive. Poor is not about what we have. According to Paul and according to John, poor is not about what you have. Poor is about feeling disempowered. So by contrast, rich is about empowerment. Something in your possession is a gift. So what are you going to do with that gift? So in Smyrna, going back to Revelation, in Smyrna, this group of people, they're being cut out of the local economy. They're intentionally being ostracized and accused of things specifically so that they will basically get starved out of the community. They're being slandered. They're being ostracized. Some people are being jailed unjustly. And so John says to them, it turns out you actually still do have some power. And I think, and again, to us, just reading this at face value, this could feel unhelpful. It could feel tone deaf. But I think to the people who were first hearing this, I think it would have felt like good news. I think this would have been a very needed reminder of we're not quite done yet. Our story is not through. Yeah, this is really awful. And the things that we're going through, we should not be going through. We do not deserve to be going through the pain and the suffering that we're going through. However, we are not out of options. We are not without power here. So I think the people receiving this might have received it as like, okay, John's saying we can still do this. We still have some amount of power. So there are a lot of things in this that may or may not be difficult to identify with. But maybe the question for us as we look at this letter is, does any of us know what it means to feel disempowered? Have you ever felt like you were out of options? Have you ever felt like no matter what I do, the outcome will always be the same? I think most of us, most of the time, live with a pretty solid amount of resources in comparison to the rest of the world. Most of us got here in a car that we own. Most of us are working towards owning. Most of us have a job that pays a steady wage. Most of us have people that we can call if we really needed help. Most of us are able to get through the day with enough food and don't have to worry about, are we going to have enough food tomorrow? I think most of us in this community, most of these things could be used to describe us. Most of us, by the standards of the rest of the world, would not be described as poor. So I think one of the reasons Revelation, and honestly much of the Bible, is difficult for us to understand quite often in a 21st century Western Hemisphere context is because most of us have no direct understanding of what it means to feel this poor and this disempowered. Most of us, hopefully, have never been this low and this desperate. Now, that said, I imagine we can, at some level, all identify with the feeling of disempowerment. We can all identify with that feeling of like the tension is ratcheting up and up and up. And if your phone vibrates with a weather alert, then you may pass out from anxiety before realizing that it's just a weather alert. Are you with me? So it's even though we can't identify most of us directly with the context of the people here, I think we can all sort of find our way into the to the perspective of, oh yeah, I do understand disempowerment. I do understand what it feels like to feel backed into a corner and like I have no options. I imagine that most of us at one time or another felt like the walls were closing in and that the world was getting quite small and that our choices were drying up right before our eyes. You know what I mean? I would imagine most of us at one point or another have been in that headspace. So I imagine most of us have had one of those days or weeks or months or years where it felt like every phone call or every text message was just bad news and that our capacity to feel hopeful was drying up by the second. And so maybe John is telling the people in Smyrna, don't forget, you do actually still have choices. You aren't done yet. There is still blood in your veins, and you still have some power. You are not as powerless as you think you are. I've talked about this some before, but in 2013, I was working at a large multi-campus megachurch, and my faith was completely unraveling. I was very quietly going through now what I can look at and refer to as like a deconstruction kind of era. But at the time, it felt like I'm just like losing my grip on everything that I think is real. And it was really scary. And I remember, and I've talked about this before, but like if you work on staff at a church and you feel like you've lost your faith, it's not just like, oh no, I don't like believe in any of the stuff that I believed in anymore, which is all by itself quite scary. It's also, what am I gonna do for work if this church finds out and I get fired for not having enough faith? They did fire me, but not for that. I talked about that last week, but it was for a much dumber reason than that. But I was, I was in this place of like, I'm terrified. I'm terrified of all the different things that might happen if I don't like have some sense of like truth or reality in the midst of this. And so I remember I went to this retreat that I was told about in Southern California. It was being hosted by this writer that I follow, that I continue to have a lot of respect for. And it was like this very small, like less than 100 people gathered in a hotel courtroom in Southern California. And I remember like hearing about this writer and reading something that he had written about how he once was a pastor, and remember feeling like, oh yeah, there was this one Easter and I couldn't bring myself to believe any of the things that I was about to say, and it freaked me out. And so I felt like maybe there's something I can like go to the proverbial mountaintop in Laguna Beach, California, and find myself like maybe gaining some amount of wisdom. And so I went to this workshop, and I remember there was like some Q&A time, and it's a very small group. I'm in like the second row. I'm really close to where the guy's sitting, and I just raised my hand, and I think to myself, like, I came all the way out here. I just got to ask. And so I raised my hand and I said, hey, I remember in this book you talked about how you had lost your faith and you were a pastor. I said, I am exactly in that spot, and I don't know what to do. Like, and so he and the writer, he was telling me, and he starts talking directly to me, which was incredibly helpful. And he starts saying like all this very wise, insightful stuff. And I'm trying to receive as much of it as I can, and it was very helpful. But I remember after the session broke, I got up, and this guy that I'd never met in my life before comes over to me, and he says, hey, my name's Mike. And he said, I just wanted you to know I was here a year ago, and I had all the exact same questions that you have. I was exactly where you are. And he said, I don't necessarily have a lot of great answers for you, but I've got some friends who came with me this time. We're about to go to dinner. Do you want to come with us? And so I went to dinner with these guys, and I ended up spending about 3 hours just hanging out, and all of these guys had been on a similar journey. And I remember coming home with a newfound sense of, like, not all the answers have been revealed to me, but just sort of like I'm not in this by myself. You know what I mean? And so there was this sense of, this is not the end of a story. Maybe this was a necessary part of a story that I needed in order to grow in a way that I probably really needed to grow. And so I know that Mike, this guy, and he and I became pretty good friends. And so I know Mike felt powerless and poor when he was in that place a year before I got there. But then he reached out to me, and he gave me the gift of being seen and being understood. And so I'm sure he felt poor, but in that moment, he showed me generosity. He had something valuable, and he offered to share it with me. And so he felt poor, but at that moment, he was quite rich. Has this ever happened to you? Has someone ever come alongside you and offered support because they know what you've been through, because maybe they've been through it too? Or maybe you can share your pain and your stories with somebody else, and then maybe they won't feel quite so alone anymore. It's possible to feel poor and yet to find rich inside of you, to find that you are not as disempowered as you think you are. This is grace. This is the feeling of having more power and more in your possession than you even realize. So a couple of quick questions. as we sort of draw to a close. One is, am I aware of what I already have? Am I aware and grateful for all the ways that I am actually rich? And it's easy to fixate on all the things that we don't have, which is always the thing that makes us feel poor. If all I do is think about what I don't have, I will always walk away feeling poor and disempowered. It's a lot more challenging to become aware of what we do have, which can make us aware of all the ways that we are rich. Am I aware of what I already have? Am I aware of the stories that I have accumulated, that when I find somebody else who is also struggling, I can come alongside them and say, look, I don't really have all the answers, but you can definitely come to dinner with us tonight. Like maybe that is the most generous thing you can do for a person, which leads to the second question, which is, do I practice generosity? And this is, first of all, not a plea for money. Not at all what we're getting at here. This is a challenge to evaluate what we do have. And again, maybe this is actual like physical monetary resources. Maybe this is a story. Maybe this is a certain amount of time that you have to give. Maybe this is perspective. Maybe this is just a listening ear. Am I aware of what I already have? This is a challenge to evaluate what we have and ask questions about what it means to be generous towards others. Do I have a story that might offer encouragement? Do I have an hour or two to offer to somebody else? Do I have the ability to babysit for a single parent when they need to go on a job interview? I have things that I don't realize make me rich. By the way, how much a person has is never a strong indicator of whether or not they'll be generous. Some of the poorest people I know are the most generous people that I know. And some of the richest people that I know are some of the poorest people that I know. You know what I mean? In fact, Jesus directly addresses this in Mark chapter 12. In Mark 12, verse 41, it says this. This is a story. It says, Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowds putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus says, truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on. So it turns out for John and Jesus and Paul, it turns out rich and poor have never been about what I do and don't have. According to the scriptures, rich and poor are about what am I doing with what I do have? How do I remain empowered when I feel disempowered? You have lots of power. You have lots of choices, and you may not even realize how much power and how many choices you have. John is telling the people in Smyrna, I know things are very difficult, and I know you wake up every day feeling powerless, but you still have choices. You are not alone, and your story is not done. And the same goes for you. You have power. You have choices. You have grace. You have things in your possession that are valuable. You have choices. All of life is a gift. Whatever you have, that is part of the gift.